So overall, magazine media audiences have held steady. Currently, print and digital audiences are reported together in terms of readership, and current readership has been sitting at 224 million, around that for the past couple of years. But we see a small but steady growth in magazine media. A lot of readers are currently using both print and digital editions. That's where the majority of audience is, but an increasing number of people are reading magazines through mobile devices, such as smartphones. And so that readership has increased slowly, but with a significant trend in the past couple of years. The top 25 print magazines actually reach more adults and teens than the top 25 primetime TV shows. And so you can really see that magazines are having a large impact on popular culture and society overall. Now, in terms of the business of magazines, what makes a magazine money is really twofold. The first is advertisements. And in the typical magazine right now, 40% of that magazine will actually be advertisements versus 60%, which will be editorial content. And there are many different ways to market magazines. The first is with regional editions. So Sports Illustrated usually does this with their college football editions, where in certain parts of the country, you're going to get a different magazine cover or different magazine stories even than you would if you were living in a different part. A split run is when you're using the same stories of the magazine, so all of the editorial content is the same, but the regional and local ads are placed instead of having national ads. And this is actually a great way to garner local advertising revenue. There are also demographic editions. You may notice that certain magazines will change their cover or even their stories and advertisements based on people's occupation, class, and zip code. We also see this with foreign language editions for some publications. So there are many different ways to kind of target your advertising to align with your readership. However, advertising isn't the largest form of revenue for magazines. Instead, it's subscriptions. In the 1950s, newsstands made up 43% of the revenue for magazines, while only 57% were subscriptions, still the majority, but pretty close. Now, newsstands only make up 9% of revenue for magazines, while subscriptions are 91%. And that's really thanks to the advent of evergreen subscriptions, which are those that automatically renew your subscription service. Now, digital has also impacted magazines in many ways. Digital and print figures are reported together, which I've stated before, but the majority of readers believe that digital only enhances print publication rather than replacing it. There are very few people who say that they prefer to only read the digital versions of their magazine. So this is partly why digital and print are reported together. In addition, the ease of publishing, thanks to desktop publishing, where you can use things like Illustrator, Photoshop, and things of that nature, make it easier for smaller publications and minority voices to publish. And so it's really a good time for a lot of smaller publications to get involved in this industry. Now, people say that they prefer print on paper for reading. And this is a large reason why printed magazines are still very much relevant rather than reading on an electronic device. And in terms of some of the major players in the magazine industry, the number one publication currently is actually AARP, which has a target audience of people who are 50 years or older. People is the second most popular, followed by Better Homes and Gardens, National Geographic, and Good Housekeeping. So you can see that with people, we have celebrity, entertainment news, Better Homes and Gardens, and Good Housekeeping really target more uh, housewares and home life type styles, while National Geographic focuses primarily on images and geography. In terms of the top 10 magazine brands that are broken out by print, digital, web, mobile web, video, and total brand audience, while AARP does the best in terms of overall audience, it makes a lot of sense that the older generations will not be as active on web versions. And so ESPN is actually strongest in web. WebMD is also another very popular website, followed by All Recipes, which is actually locally based here in Alabama. In terms of mobile web, we see very similar, although People is a little bit stronger in their mobile web than their desktop, laptop web versions. Video, currently ESPN, Vanity Fair, and Vogue tend to be the most popular video sites for magazines. And because of that, emphasis on multimedia formats, ESPN is considered the top magazine, while AARP, despite having the largest print and digital audience for total brand audience, remains fifth. Now, there is a lot of media that are owned by the same chains. And so Meredith is one of the largest magazine chains. They purchased Time in 2017. And so Meredith owns Better Homes and Gardens, Family Circle, More, Shape, as well as former Time publications like Coastal Living, Cooking Light, Entertainment Weekly, a lot of the really big names. Advanced Publications Condé Nast division holds Vanity Fair, GQ, and Vogue, so some of the most popular fashion magazines. And then Hearst, which recently purchased Rodale in 2018, owns some of the other larger magazines such as Cosmo, Esquire, Elle, and O. Now, magazine readership overall is pretty diverse. African American adults read an average of 9.7 print magazine issues per month compared to 7.6 issues per month for all US adults. So you can see that the Black community is very important in terms of magazine readership. Recognizing that the average reader reads 7.6 issues per month, you can see that Hispanic Americans or Latinx individuals actually read more than average, and Asian Americans are right there as well. LGBTQ plus members actually read 8.5 print magazine issues per month, which is higher than the US average as well. So you can see that readership is very diverse, and yet a lot of the voices that are portrayed within magazines aren't necessarily as diverse. But I think the reason for the diversity in magazine readership in particular is because of its focus on specialization and target audience. Now, magazine specialization really began in the 1950s. It divides the readership of a magazine by type, and that can be based on the topic, it can be based on the reader, it can be based on demographics. And so there are many different ways to specialize a magazine, but you'll notice that there's not really many magazines that are just national in focus, general audience. Instead, you have magazines that tend to really target one type of person. So in terms of advertiser types, you have consumer advertisers, which will try to advertise in magazines like O and Cosmo. You have business or trade magazines and business and trade advertisers, which create publications like Advertising Age and Progressive Grocer. You even have farm magazines because there are advertisers who want to sell farm equipment or developments within farming technology. And so you get very specialized types of publications in that way. It's important to note that some magazines rely solely on subscription and newsstand sales as opposed to advertising. And so those are usually offset by in the specialization category of advertiser types. So some of the subscription newsstand sales magazines are Ms., Consumer Reports, and Cooks Illustrated. Now, you can also specialize a magazine by target audience. Men and women's magazines were some of the first to really specialize in this manner. One of the most well-known brands, of course, is Playboy for men's magazines. They really became famous with a calendar reprint of Marilyn Monroe, but they've been a heavy player in the men's magazine industry since the early 50s. Playboy really peaked in the 1960s with a 7 million circulation. And in March 2016, they actually had the first issue with no nudity. That didn't last very long. It lasted about a year. They returned to nudity back in 2017 because they recognized that that was kind of their brand, right? But they are still working to kind of diversify their magazine and their reach, and they had their first transgender playmate featured at the bottom of our screen in November of 2017. Now, Hugh Hefner, its creator, is the only man to ever be featured solo on the cover. Instead, it really focuses a lot on women and their ability to entertain men, like it or not. The other two types of men's magazines are health magazines and lifestyle magazines. Playboy would be considered a lifestyle magazine. You could also call it a pornography magazine if you wish. But health magazines are like fitness or men's health, while Maxim would be a lifestyle magazine. Now, women's magazines in the 1950s and early 60s really focused on women as homemakers. It wasn't until Miss magazine in 1971 that there was a larger audience for women who were trying to do things outside of the home. Miss was actually created as a one-shot sample insert in New York Magazine. It was supposed to just be a special edition of a New York magazine. But within the first few weeks, it sold 300,000 copies, got New York Magazine 26,000 new subscriptions and 20,000 new readers. So the industry really recognized a need for this type of publication, and Miss became a national voice. It was really important in the women's movement in particular because it was the first national magazine to make feminist voices audible. And Miss had a special commitment to women of color that a lot of other women's magazines did not during the time. Now, other types of specialization would be sports magazines. So Sports Illustrated is the most popular general sports magazine in history. In 2018, their circulation was about 2.75 million. They've been heavily criticized for their swimsuit issue. However, that criticism is really argued by the fact that it is a $1 billion revenue generator for Sports Illustrated. One of the reasons that the swimsuit issue is often criticized is for its portrayal of women as sex objects. You can see that the magazine has changed quite a bit since its first edition, there in the middle, to the ones that you can see on the right. But Sports Illustrated has recently declared their commitment to showing people of all body types. In 2015, they had their first plus-size model, Robin Lawley, who was only a size 12. In case you didn't know, the average American woman is a size 14, so size 12 isn't really considered plus size. But they have tried to make a larger commitment with Ashley, I think her name is Gransom, being featured, and she actually is a larger plus size model. So they're trying to make strides, but it's still a large revenue generator for the magazine and therefore still continues. Now, Rolling Stone is known really as an alternative magazine focused primarily on music. It's one of the most popular for music magazines. It originally started out alternative, but shifted quickly to mainstream, and it currently has a 1.4 million circulation. National Geographic has been around since 1888. It actually helped pioneer color photography within the magazine industry. National Geographic was the first to publish underwater and aerial color pictures, and their readership was the highest in 1970s with 10 million and has begun to decline since then. Magazine specialization is also done by age. One of the first age specialization magazines was Boys Life in 1912. The top kids magazine is Highlights, which currently has a 2 million circulation. I know I used to play Highlights when I was a kid. One thing to note is that this magazine is purposefully ad-free. You can only get it through subscription. And of course, there are many female teen magazines, such as Teen Vogue, 17, things like that. And those are actually very popular magazines as well. But the most successful age-targeted magazine is the AARP magazine, which is for retired persons, people who are 50 and older. It has 38 million in circulation, and it's the most read magazine in the United States. Now, there are other categories of specialization. One of them is elite, and this is really targeting the upper class. You can think of this as a high culture magazine. The New Yorker is probably the best example of elite magazines. It started in 1925. It's really been characterized by a combination of literature, criticism, humor, and journalism. The New Yorker has dealt with a lot of political and social issues in recent years. It very much appeals to the highly educated urban audience. In fact, the New Yorker won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage on the Harvey Weinstein sexual assault cases and the Me Too movement. There's actually a really wonderful book called She Said from the authors, the writers of New York Magazine, the New Yorker magazine, who received the Pulitzer Prize. Now, minority specialization is also very important in the magazine industry. As we saw earlier, minorities make up a large portion of the magazine readership. Some of the most popular in terms of Black culture are Ebony, which was started in the 40s. It was very similar to Life magazine, but it was targeted specifically for Black readers. Essence began in the late 60s, and it was the first major magazine that was targeted specifically for Black women. Vibe was started in the early 90s, and it was dedicated to hip hop and urban music culture. It was written very similarly in style to Rolling Stone. Now, there are other minority communities that are targeted through magazines. Some of the most well-known are The Advocate, which was started in the late 60s for the LGBTQ plus community. And then there are also magazines that are especially targeted to Latinx communities, and there are even Spanish versions of general audience magazines like Cosmo, Sports Illustrated, People, and Glamour. Tabloids are another type of magazine, although the magazine industry wishes that they didn't have to be associated with them. Tabloids are kind of the redheaded stepchild of the magazine industry. Sometimes they push the limits of decency and credibility. If you've ever been walking by the grocery checkout, you may have seen some of these terrible headlines. One of the earliest tabloids was National Enquirer. It was started in 1926 by Hearst, and Pope actually purchased National Enquirer in the 50s with a goal to fight for the rights of man and human decency and dignity. Yeah, that didn't last long. Pope actually started using the Gore formula, that the more you could shock a reader, the more likely they would be to purchase your magazine. Other tabloids are Globe and Star. Overall, tabloid sales are down after they peaked in popularity in 1980. However, tabloids still have the ability to influence popular culture, even though we may think of them as a joke. It's amazing how even just seeing some of the headlines can potentially impact our lives, even if we're just passing by them in the grocery checkout. For instance, the Enquirer actually had a catch and kill agreement with former Playboy model Karen McDougal. They paid her $150,000 for her story about an alleged affair with now President Donald Trump, but they never intended to publish the story. Their idea was that they would make her sign, a non-disclosure agreement, make her have an exclusive with Enquirer, but they never intended to publish a story. So they were effectively killing her claim. And while that has since leaked, this is something that the Enquirer did purposefully. It's also been shown that tabloids were more likely to publish anti-Hillary stories prior to the election. And again, whether we recognize it or not, continual exposure to negative primers or ideas, headlines, photos of an individual or a candidate can make us think a certain way without us even being aware of it. And so some researchers have suggested that some of the influence of the tabloids affected the presidential election. But tabloids are best known for these crazy images, crazy headlines, and that's just why sometimes we think of them as not being very influential. Sometimes a good laugh, like Bat Child, but they can have the potential to affect us through their media effects.